Spider-Man can do whatever a spider can, but when it comes to his live-action portrayals, who did the best job of doing what a spider can? Spider-Man is one of the most recognizable and well-liked superheroes of all time. A nigh-invulnerable last of his species, super being, or a genius billionaire with a need for justice and a flair for branding is cool and all, but there's just something about a superhero that still struggles to pay rent that is just kind of relatable. We may wish we were Bruce Wayne, but most of us know that we're Peter Parker. So to that end, let's go ahead and take a look at all the live-action portrayals of Peter Parker and see who did it best. Look, if you're going to do a ranked list, someone has to be on the bottom of that list, and then there's going to be a fan of that version who will get upset, because how dare you suggest the actress' portrayal was a weaker Spider-Man? Do you even comic book? From 1977 to 1978, there was a live-action Spider-Man series that spanned all of 13 episodes, starring Nicholas Hammond as the grad student Peter Parker, who was bitten by the radioactive spider and became the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. These days, the show only ever comes up in situations like this, where someone writes about Spider-Man and finds an opportunity to Marvel, and Marvel's first attempt to bring the wall crawler to life. Just months after CBS pulled the plug on the Amazing Spider-Man series, Richard Donner's Superman would be the first step in the creation of the modern superhero movie. There was no Mary Jane Watson or Gwen Stacy or even Betty Brant. He wouldn't even get a romantic interest until season 2. In one way, it was decades ahead of its time, as that second season only had 8 episodes, and in its first, 5. J. Jonah Jameson was given a prescription for chill pills and was just more Mr. Grant from the Mary Tyler Moore Show than he was the fire-spewing publisher that we know and love. Perhaps the biggest drag on the series was the complete lack of Spider-Man villains. They were already spending a large amount of money to create the practical effects of stunt coordinator as Spider-Man Fred Waugh climbing the sides of buildings and swinging from building to building, which they filmed one time and then used a lot. With only 13 episodes, an uneven tone, and barely any of the iconic supporting cast and regular criminal bad guys every episode, you might assume that it was canceled for poor ratings. Nope, it actually had some of the best ratings that CBS had at the time. Specifically with the all-powerful demo, which is to say people between the ages of 18 and 49, who watch things and presumably buy stuff. Instead, it was more of a victim of a budding superhero golden age that had CBS running an Arrowverse worth of programming. The Incredible Hulk was incredibly popular. They had just finished off a run of Captain Marvel and Isis. They had taken over production of Wonder Woman from ABC after the first season, moving that show from World War II to the show's contemporary time. There were also 2 TV movies that didn't make it to series: Captain America with his red and transparent shield, and the Doctor Strange movie that was, up until very recently, something that I thought was my Sinbad in Shazam. But nope, it was very, very real. Spider-Man almost made a return, according to Hammond, in a 1984 Incredible Hulk TV movie. The Incredible Hulk did go on to become a primordial MCU, hosting Daredevil, Thor, and Kingpin, among others. Given his status as an answer to a trivia question and having never fought a single supervillain, Hammond ends up at the bottom of this list and was probably wandering around LA, standing in for New York in No Way Home, unable to join the other Spider-Men. That's the story I'm going with anyways. The ever-positive Stan Lee wasn't exactly happy with the American live-action Spider-Man show, thinking that they had removed too much about what made the character so special. Lest you mistake that for a streak of puritanism, though, Stan the Man loved the adaptation that was produced for Japanese television by the Toei Company. Japanese Spider-Man was Takuya Yamashiro, who fought evil as Spider-Man in Tokyo. It's a familiar story, really. Takuya was a motorcycle racer who watched the spaceship the Marveler crash land. Naturally, when his space archaeologist father investigates but dies, he then winds up racing the evil Dr. Monster and his Iron Cross army, who themselves were aliens. The aliens were being hunted by Garia, the last of the Spider Warriors, who juices Takuya with his own blood, which gives him spider powers, along with a bracelet to summon a spider suit and shoot webs. And also control the Marveler, which can change from a spaceship into a giant robot. Because when in doubt, giant robot. The show couldn't have less to do with the original Peter Parker Spider-Man, but Stan Lee loved it. For Lee, it was a comic book come to life, and he knew that different cultures would have different expectations, so he wasn't so precious about the actual origins of the character as long as it was fun. The son of a diplomat in Japan and a big comic book fan, Gene Pelk had asked Marvel if he could try and crack the Japanese market for Marvel Comics, since they already had a robust comic book scene in Japan. It was a robust scene that Marvel had failed to gain any traction with, but Pelk felt that he could find the bridge between Marvel titles and Japanese audiences. The ins and outs of the madcap production that ran for 44 episodes of a single season are detailed in a 616 documentary series on Disney+. there was a legacy outside of Japanese Spider-Man. The Spider-Man plus giant robot formula worked so well that Toei decided to giant robot up their Super Sentai series, which, funnily enough, Stan Lee actually had a hand in some of the earlier seasons, specifically Battle Fever J. If you'd like to see an entire video about Super Sentai, please blow up the comments because I'd love to do that. Now, Super Sentai would eventually be bought up and repackaged for the US market under the title Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. When you really think about it, Power Rangers is kind of the equivalent of putting a phrase into Google Translate back and forth a couple of times. Part of the deal was that Marvel would get some Japanese characters to publish as a trade-off for a Japanese Captain America and Marvel's take on Dracula in Tomb of Dracula. These characters were a pair of Japanese giant robots that in America became the Shogun Warriors. The Shogun Warrior toys looked cool, but they were really terrible. 0 points of articulation, you couldn't even raise their arms. You rolled them along plastic wheels in the feet and then tried to keep track of all the choking hazard missiles you could launch for about 6 inches from a giant plastic thing. They were totally awful. I own 2 of them. Now, no one else on this list has a giant robot, and when it comes to raw strength, that should probably mean the Japanese Spider-Man is the strongest. And the Japanese series is super campy and really fun. But because I'm still salty about the non-posable Shogun Warriors whose missiles got vacuumed up the first 2 weeks of ownership, this version of Spider-Man winds up being 4th in the rankings. Still though, it gave us Super Sentai as we know it today, and as a massive fan of tokusatsu, I guess I'm kinda gonna give it some credit for that alone. I think that we as lovers of comic book movies don't understand how important X-Men Origins Wolverine is to the world of comic book movies. Is it a good movie? Hell no. While it gave us a confounding portrayal of Deadpool, it did put Ryan Reynolds and the character together, which worked out eventually. But it did mean that a franchise could produce one less than spectacular entry, and that doesn't mean that you have to wrap up the genre altogether until you find someone who wants to bring realism to it. Director Sam Raimi had delivered 2 movies that still stand among the best comic book movies ever made in Spider-Man and especially Spider-Man 2. And then one Spider-Man movie that gave us finger guns and aggressive jazz dancing. The thing is, Spider-Man 3 really wasn't that terrible. It just wasn't Spider-Man 2. But then again, what is? Regardless, a dispirited Sam Raimi and the studio quietly packed their plans for Spider-Man 4 that would have seen Doc Connors turned into the Lizard, and potentially feature John Malkovich as the Vulture and Anne Hathaway as the Black Cat. It's okay, she'd go on to play another cat-themed character in another superhero movie, so it sort of worked out for her. However, this quote-unquote failure gave way to the rapid and little awkward reboot of the franchise, this time with Andrew Garfield eager in the role as the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. 5 years had transpired between Maguire's last Spider-Man movie and Garfield's first in The Amazing Spider-Man. That was actually less time than there was between Spider-Man 1 and Spider-Man 3. By 2012, when The Amazing Spider-Man came out, it was becoming clear that the Marvel Cinematic Universe wasn't an overly ambitious undertaking from a fledgling production company, but a building juggernaut that was now under the wing of the House of the Mouse. Sony didn't want to sleep on having Marvel's most recognizable property, so, you know, they did what they did. Raimi's adaptation had been a near picture-perfect representation of the comics. We still can't imagine anyone else as J. Jonah other than J.K. Simmons. Rosemary Harris looks so much like Aunt May that it seemed like she was formed by pressing human-sized silly putty on the page, which then reformed itself into that image. With the MCU spinning out into a franchise that could release 2 or 4 entries per year, Sony was eager to get in on that by utilizing Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery. Mostly, they were on the fast track to get to the Sinister Six, Sony's white whale regarding their Spider-Man license. With Kirsten Dunst having just delivered 3 straight movies, speedrunning through Peter Parker's true love, The Amazing Spider-Man instead focused on the tragic love interest of Gwen Stacy. With the tragedy of Gwen Stacy looming over the series and a need for The Amazing Spider-Man 2 to set up too many things at once, all the reboot did was remind us that the MCU didn't have Marvel's biggest star. After his appearance in No Way Home though, Garfield's portrayal has been given a second look. And while Amazing Spider-Man 2 was still too crowded and busy and the Ultimates-inspired Electro not quite working, Garfield himself actually conveyed Peter Parker's nervous energy that finds Parker using humor to cope with the fear and uncertainty that comes with his new role as a crime fighter. Plus, Garfield's Peter, embodying a fan's perception of the Amazing Spider-Man series, was just incredibly charming. Garfield's portrayal embraced Parker's tragic side, failing to save Gwen Stacy, and even going so far as to cut off the one brute force fight he would have had by cutting to credits the moments before he made contact with Rhino. That alone earned the budding franchise fans' ire on top of all of the other problems that led to this series being cut short. But we got MCU Spider-Man, so, you know, all's well that ends well. For whatever we lost by Sony closing up shop on Garfield's Spider-Man after only 2 outings, it did lead to the greatest thing that happened within the MCU, bringing the Spectacular Spider-Man into the fold. By the way, they should have called it the Spectacular Spider-Man to maintain the convention set up by the previous series, but they instead went with home puns because no one asks me about these things. If 5 years was a short throw from franchise reboot, then Tom Holland stealing Captain America's shield as Spider-Man just 2 years after Garfield was throwing a manhole cover at Rhino must have seemed like night and day. Since Homecoming would be the 3rd franchise in 17 years and Spider-Man's origins being one of the best known even before the 2 franchises back-to-back portrayed it, Marvel decided to take it as understood that a radioactive spider had gotten its fangs into Spider-Man and that losing Ben had instilled a similar sense of responsibility into the character, even before Aunt May delivered the iconic guiding principle for Peter Parker. When we first see Parker, he actually tells Stark, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you. That's basically with great power comes great responsibility in way too many words. Holland wound up making a big splash holding his own against Teen Captain America in Civil War, including unnerving Bucky Barnes and Sam Wilson, which was just a delight to see. While he got no giant robot, Holland's Peter Parker did get upgrades layered on upgrades. Stark gave him a smart suit, and then almost immediately upped the game with the Iron Spider suit. He even got a bit of a magic upgrade after Doctor Strange's spell jumped off the rails in No Way Home. Tip for the future, Strange: if the spell is delicate and has multiverse-spanning ramifications, perhaps take a moment to explain to the teenager what's going on, and maybe ask some questions before you risk the fabric of space-time. This is why Wong is a better Sorcerer Supreme. This Spider-Man is also the only Peter that we saw lose all control. Garfield talked about how he stopped pulling his punches, which I might remind you is terrifying, because Spider-Man is very strong and spends most of his time trying to not hit nearly as close to as hard as he can so that he doesn't liquefy people. Part of the whole great responsibility thing. Garfield talks about it as the consequence of not being able to save Stacy. But when Holland's Peter gets his hands on Osborn after he took Aunt May from him, we not only got to see Spider-Man not holding back, but just how durable and terrifying Green Goblin really is. It wasn't the first time either. This Spider-Man was part of the group of heroes that came the closest to actually beating Thanos on their own, while he had 4 Infinity Stones. It should be noted that Thor, Captain America, and Iron Man struggled to do that against a Thanos that didn't have a gauntlet, while Captain America was super Thored up. Man, was that hammer lifting scene just so gratifying. Speaking of Endgame, Spider-Man also made a valiant run through Thanos' army with the Infinity Gauntlet, trying to make it to Louise's van before getting overwhelmed and then introduced to Captain Marvel herself. And you know, considering the fact that he's just a kid, he did pretty damn well. Enough to amuse Captain Marvel, and her powers come from an Infinity Stone and she blows up giant space warships by ramming herself through them. So, you know, impressing her is definitely saying something. All in all, with that kind of CV and Holland's natural agility from his dance and gymnastics background, how could he not be considered the strongest? The last man standing on the list of live-action Spider-Men... Spider-Men? Sure, let's go with that. You never really forget your first when it comes to feature film Spider-Men. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man came out a year after the first X-Men movie that famously scoffed at the idea of comic book accurate looks. In that movie, Logan questioned the black leather X-Men teen look, to which Cyclops quipped, "Would you prefer yellow spandex?" Yes. Yes, we would. But we needed a lot more franchise movies for studios to understand that superheroes look unreal as soon as they use their powers. So there's no need to shy away from the comic book look unless it's particularly goofy. In 4 more years, Nolan's Batman Begins would hit theaters, lauding its realistic take on the Caped Crusader as an antidote to the campy Batman and Robin and Tim Burton's stylized neo-Art Deco look. Even the MCU fretted about how to portray the fantastic as real before eventually embracing the conventions of comic books, including costumes and fun codenames. In the middle of this entire environment is Raimi's complete love note to one of his favorite characters in the world. It had all been part of a long struggle for the camp horror icon to make his way into comic book movie land. His first attempt had actually been to helm an adaptation of the classic pulp hero The Shadow, but he lost out to what would eventually become the Alec Baldwin rendition. Instead, Raimi created a new Silver Age horror-style superhero movie in Darkman, which, if you haven't seen the movie yet, do yourself a favor. It is delightfully odd while never ruining it by winking in its own weirdness. Plus, you get to see Liam Neeson demand a stuffed elephant like it kidnapped his daughter. It established a lot of what became an important part of the Spider-Man adaptation, including how Spider-Man personifies in a way the power of New York City itself. The best example comes from a scene that remains one of the most iconic comic book movie scenes in Spider-Man 2, where Maguire's Parker puts his body on the line, all to stop a runaway subway train, which earns the reverence of the passengers, who even go so far as to let Parker know that his secret identity is safe with them. But I mean, like, none of them know who Peter Parker is. All they found out is that he's a kid, kind of. Tobey Macguire, he actually wasn't that much of a kid. Garfield would have a moment like that with the construction cranes lined up to help get Spider-Man where he needed to be in his first movie. Holland's moment with the city is cut short when he's only 93% successful in webbing the ferry together. So, you know, it kind of shows the comparison between the three versions of the character. Maguire also had to solo an attack by Sandman and Venom all at once, when most of the time Venom is more than enough to handle, though he did pretty quickly get some help from whatever the heck Harry Osborn is. We're gonna call him the Hobgoblin? Is he Green Goblin too? I don't know. With how dead on Raimi's interpretation was, it had one glaring change that would be a subject of interest among his variants. Instead of having a poor genius kid in Queens not only develop the formula for webbing, but a battle-ready mechanism for firing it off, Raimi's Spider-Man got all of his spider powers from the bit, including shooting the webbing from his wrists like an actual spider. If actual spiders had little butts on their arms, because that's where it comes out of on a spider. But a spider also doesn't walk around on two legs and come up with one-liners during fights, so I'm gonna let it slide. But Maguire's most accurate Spider-Man portrayal did more than stop trains and lift cars. It did a lot of the heavy lifting to prove that a comic book movie could still work, even if it embraced its comic book nature, and undoubtedly shaped what would become the MCU in the modern superhero movie. That's a pretty heavy lift after Batman and Robin, and for that alone, Maguire gets the top slot. You know, the two oldest actors on this list, Shinji Todo and Nicholas Hammond, are still around. And since it's been over 10 months since No Way Home came out, I feel like we've waited a reasonable enough amount of time for someone to give us a short scene involving the two other live-action Spider-Mans. Get on it, Marvel.